Hi, I'm Kristen Holzner. I am a professor in the sociology department and an iGEM faculty member here at the University of Idaho. And so as I am referred to in this building as the people person, in my building I am not referred to as the people person because we are all people. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about human behavior and cybersecurity. If you've been coming to these iGEM talks, you would have learned several things, among which is the fact that we are under attack. Jim has made sure that we are aware of that, as has Daniel. The dangers of this attack are tangible and quite costly, and that average people fail to take proper precautions against these crimes. So I want to talk to you today about why that is the case. Why is it that people are not taking proper precautions? Interestingly, as I plugged my computer in today, like literally 5 minutes ago, I had a notification from Norton that there was a vulnerability blocked on my computer. This is particularly interesting because if you can't see, I'm using a Mac, and about 75% of Mac users do not use Norton or any sort of antivirus software. About 25% of PC users also do not do that. I'm not going to go too much into the extent of the danger because we've talked about that for the last several weeks. Most of you are quite aware of it. But I'm actually going to focus most of my talk on phishing, why people fall victim to phishing scams. And just to give you a sense of how many people do fall victim to phishing scams, there was a study recently done by IBM. They looked at 3 million internet users over 3 months, and they found that about 45% of users, when directed to a phishing site, will fall victim to the attack. So, given the fact that we know that these problems exist, why is it that people fail to take precautions? Why is it that they fall victim to attacks? And I will say, as I was preparing to do this talk today, I was actually really surprised at how little research there is on this, how very few studies have been done on human behavior and cybersecurity. So that gives me a lot of ideas for future directions that we can take the iGEM team and the iGEM project, which I'll mention a couple at the end of the talk. But back to the questions at hand. The first reason, which you may guess, just as smart, intelligent, capable people, is that there is a lack of knowledge. That people simply do not know that they are at risk, right? And so there's been a number of studies that look at this particular issue, just the fact that people don't know they should be concerned. So Garner Report, Identity Theft Resource Center, Cisco have all done sort of little studies looking at whether or not people are aware that there's an issue. And so what some of these studies have found is that only about half of internet users can answer the question, what is phishing? And only 25% of people actually answer it correctly. Everybody else who tries to answer it says it must have something to do with that band, fish. So people are equally likely to get it right as to think it has to do with the band. Half of people are understanding what phishing is, but what people do is in order to understand what would make a site trustworthy, if they go to a website and they want to evaluate whether or not it's trustworthy, they determine it based on the website's appearance. And there's a number of websites dedicated to information on how to make your site more trustworthy. So this is 16 tips to make your site seem trustworthy. So there's actually people who are teaching others to do this, right? People capitalize on the idea that appearance equates with trustworthiness. About half of people know to be cautious when they're asked about financial information in emails. And about 18% of employees share their passwords with their colleagues and see no problem with that. Right, so people do not know. People do not know that they are under attack. They do not know the costs associated with cybersecurity issues. So one of the few really well-designed studies that has been done on this was done by the security technology company Wombat. Many of you heard of them? Any of you? So they set out to do a study to look at how people decided whether or not to respond to an email. And it was actually a really well done experiment. They recruited 56 participants in Pittsburgh through Craigslist, through flyers, a variety of means. They eliminated anyone who worked in IT, so they didn't want people who weren't sort of the average Joe on the street to participate. And then, the 56 people they had left, they did one-on-one interviews with them, and then they did an experiment where they gave them a wallet and a fake role. So they were they were all called like Joe Smith, or it was Patty Smith, I think it was actually, but they all were given a name and a fake identity with a credit card from Citibank, an Amazon account, and their password, PayPal account, and a password, a number of other sort of identifications, social security number, and these were all fake, right? These were all created for this fake identity, and then a friend, and that friend's information who they would be receiving an email from. People were allowed to either use a PC or a Mac, and they were sat down in front of a computer to respond to email as this fake person. And then they put a video camera over their shoulder so they could watch what they were doing, right? And this is just a picture of a wombat, because I'm going to keep talking about the study, but I wanted to change the slide, and he's really cute. So participants sat down. They looked at a series of 8 emails. The first email was actually not one that was dangerous. It was just to get participants to be sort of familiar with what the task was, and to sort of make sure that they understood what they were supposed to do. So there was a short message that was sent to this fake Pat person who they were playing from an email of the company they worked for. And it was asking them to change a meeting time that they had scheduled. And so they were supposed to reply to it in the same way they would at their actual job. So that whether that meant calling the person or not doing anything or sending an email in response, people were expected to just behave normally. Then they had a series of other emails, and this is a list of them above. So they all contained links to web pages, progressing from legitimate to more obviously phishing emails, phishing schemes and scams. They were instructed to handle each in the same way, to do whatever it was that they would normally do, and to look in that fake wallet that they had been given for more information if they needed any. For each email, then they were expected to talk out loud, to describe what they were doing, why they were doing what they were doing, why they decided to delete an email or click on a link. If they voiced suspicion about an email, it was neither confirmed nor denied by the interviewer. It was just, they were just asked to sort of explain their thinking process. Right, so you can see how the email was supposed to be coming, or looked like it was coming from different places, and whether or not it was phishing, and then how they were supposed to sort of figure out whether or not it was a phishing account or email. So this email, it was about a meeting. This email was about a cool picture someone had seen. Amazon, Citibank, an article, a PayPal account, Amazon. And the last one you can't see, but it was their friend Katrina who was supposed to be emailing them. And so, again, as they went along, they got ones that were more and more suspicious looking. Then after they went through this experiment, they were set up and they did a follow-up interview with the interviewer to talk about what factors led them to decide whether or not a site was trustworthy. So they were shown screens and asked whether or not they would measure what on these sort of websites they would measure as trustworthy or not. They were also asked to rank from a scale of 1 to 7 how bad the consequences would be if something happened. So the 5 things that they ranked were whether or not, on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being worse, would the general consequences of complying with a suspicious email be bad, just in general, scale of 1 to 7. How about having your credit card number stolen, your bank account compromised, social security number stolen, or receiving large amounts of spam data? So what they found is that people rated, not surprisingly, that having their social security number compromised would be the sort of biggest negative consequence to falling for phishing, followed by their bank account, followed by just sort of the general danger, and then having their credit card number stolen and the sort of influx of spam as not being a major concern for them relative to the others. One of the findings that I find most interesting is that 25% of participants in this study said that they had been the victims of fraud, that they had either had their identity or their credit card stolen at some point. None of them had ever reported having their bank account hacked. However, people who had been victimized before, so this 25% of participants, were more likely to fall for the phishing attacks than were people who had not, right? So you don't learn from being a victim. That's the most interesting, and that's been replicated in other studies, that people who are victims are not learning to not be victims again. So the question then, which we don't have a really solid answer to, is whether there's something innately gullible about certain types of people who fall victims for this. Right? And so that's one area of research that should be done. So the things that people were aware of. So people were aware that there were certain things they were supposed to look for to know whether or not an email was suspicious. And one was that 95% of participants knew that they should look to make sure the email was actually coming from the person that it said it was coming from, whether the email address was correct. However, even though 95% of people knew that that was what they were supposed to look for, it didn't affect whether or not they read and responded and used the email. They just knew it was something to pay attention to. 85% of people knew that if they went to a website and there was a secure site lock, that meant something, but none of them knew what it meant, and they couldn't tell a legitimate lock from a non-legitimate lock. So it didn't affect their actions at all. 80% of people thought that broken images on a web page, like having an X through an image instead of the actual picture, was something that should be alerting to them, but most of the time they just believed that it was an internet issue or a problem with their computer. They never thought it had anything to do with the website. 55% of people knew that they should be concerned by strange URLs. And for some, this actually was a reason to be wary of the website, and they would close out of it. But most people just saw it as an annoyance as opposed to something to be suspicious about. And then finally, a third of people, about 35%, knew that there was a difference between HTTP and HTTPS, the start of URLs, but they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what that meant. They just knew that that was something, but they couldn't tell you what that was. Okay, so people just lack awareness. But even when they were aware, right, it did not translate into increased caution or increased sort of monitoring of their own behavior. So what did change people's behavior, right? That's what we really want to know is how can we do this more effectively? How can we teach people about these things? And about half of respondents, half of people who participated in the study, did get suspicious and did react if they were asked for financial information. So if they were asked if their bank account or their credit card number or their social security number was asked for, then they were suspicious. However, that didn't apply if the email appeared to be from a legitimate website such as Amazon. So if Amazon asked them to click on a link and change their bank account information, they would do it, right? But if a non sort of corporate email address did that, they would not. So it's not consistently a concern to them. Sort of the last thing I want to show you about this study, which I actually think is the most important piece, are the strategies that participants did use, right? So I'm telling you all the things that didn't affect them, but what did affect them? So people used the following strategies to determine whether or not an email was legitimate. Whether or not it appeared to be for them. So people would be suspicious if the email said, "Dear," if it didn't say their name. If it didn't say, like, "Dear Bob Jones," that's a terrible example. That's a conservative right university. That's what I also study, is conservative ideology. So we'll go with Bob Jones. If it said "Dear Bob Jones," they were more likely to see it as legitimate than if it didn't have a name, right? So if it appeared to be for them, then they were more willing to see it as a legitimate email. If it was a business that they normally were a customer for, they were less likely to see anything as suspicious. So if they had an Amazon account or they had a PayPal account, they were less likely to see an email from something that purported to be Amazon or PayPal as suspicious. And then finally, they believed that companies of repute use email in order to contact their customers. So they didn't see it so they actually saw it as a positive thing to get an email from somebody that looked like Amazon as opposed to not. So the questions then is how do we teach people that you should not click on links to change your bank account or your password in an email? And before I talk a little bit more about that, I want to quickly do a diversion to talk about age, because they did a second study that looked at age. So it was also done by Wombat Securities, and they looked at 515 faculty, staff, and students at the Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. They emailed everyone in the study a series of emails. Before the study started, they were all given a fake phishing email with a URL, and if they clicked on the link, then it would take them to a training website where they learned about phishing. Right? And then after that, they were sent a series of 7 emails, 3 that were regular and 4 that were phishing emails over a month. And what was found is that people between the ages of 18 and 25 were far more likely to fall for a phishing attack than were older people. Okay? And there's some, as a sociologist, right, I read that and I say, well, it also might have to do with education, right? Because these are faculty who are the ones who are not responding as opposed to students who are the ones who are responding. But there's some sort of generation gap, whether it's a knowledge gap or an experience gap or something is happening between students and faculty in terms of responding to phishing attacks. However, anyone want to guess what the average or what the sort of median response rate was for a number of people who fell victim to these attacks? Take a guess.
45%.
They're close. 46. Excellent. That's a gold star anyway. And just continuing on this generational story, the National Cyber Security Alliance did a similar sort of much smaller scale project where they looked at how millennials responded to these email things. And I wasn't trying to suggest it by this that your students are not millennials, but I suspect your students are smarter about these things than mine. So they argued that 82% of students of millennials protect their laptops, 61% protect their phones, password protect their phones, 37% regularly back up their data monthly, about 26% do not change their passwords on a mobile banking account. So, but I don't have comparative numbers to older generations in this regard. All right, just that last piece about phishing. So that was my little age diversion, and now I want to go back. Is it irrational for customers, for people, to base trust on appearance, normality, and reputation in making decisions about whether or not an email seems legitimate? And it might be, right? To people in this room, that might very clearly be something that's irrational, right? But to them, it's not, right? They don't have the knowledge or the information to see these things as dangerous. And an example, a very recent example, is that this Heartbleed scam, right, was going on. And there's an organization that actually, Dr. Baumgartner pointed this out to me because I did not know this had happened, wherein this UK parenting website called Mumsnet had 1.5 million of their users were the victims of this attack. But in order to tell their customers that they were victims, they sent them an email saying, you were a victim of this attack, click here to change your password, right? So they actually went and did the exact thing that people are told not to do, right? So it's conflicting messages, right? If businesses are going to ask their consumers to click on links to change their password, there's 2 messages people are getting in this. So the first reason people do this, they don't understand, they don't have knowledge. The second is that they don't understand the costs, right? This is just a table of showing the long-term or the estimated losses from phishing in 2012 by country. It's actually not that relevant to what I'm talking about, but I just needed a picture for you. So what I am going to tell you is that people make a variety of decisions, use a variety of tactics in order to make decisions about taking action on anything, right? So economists talk about sort of the cost-benefit analysis, right? That's something you're probably familiar with. Social scientists in general look at the need to fit in, right? People are going to make decisions if there was a popular thing to do, right? If everyone has antivirus software in their computers and their friends are pressuring them to do it, then they're going to do it. But if that's not happening, they're less likely to do it, right? And also the power of stories, right? So these emotional stories about like the grandma who gets a call from her grandma or granddaughter who's traveling in Europe and suddenly needs $500, right? That's an emotional story, so it sticks to people. People are going to fall for scams that have that emotional story with it less often if they hear those stories. But people aren't getting those messages about costs, right? People don't recognize that they're not getting peer pressured. And they don't understand sort of the cost side of the cost-benefit analysis. generally people assume that if their credit card is compromised, their credit card companies are going to protect them. Right? It's not going to be any personal loss for them. They just need to get a new card. They don't understand any loss to themselves if their email or Facebook accounts are hacked. Right? Maybe a moment of embarrassment as someone posts statuses that are not relevant to them, or having to sort of go through and tell all their friends that this happened. But largely, it's not something that's going to be detrimental to their life. Right? And they don't see costs that businesses accrue for these as being victims of these scams. Right? They don't see the indirect way in which they're paying more for services because companies have to pay for this security. So we need to make people more aware of the costs if we want people to do something differently. And then the third part of the story is that people don't see themselves as vulnerable. And that actually, statistically, it looks very interesting, right? So the odds of being a victim of a single phishing attack is about 1 in 177,000. However, right, we know that there are millions of phishing attacks that happen all the time, right? And that's something people are not aware of. The odds of being the victim of a phishing attack only in the year 2012 is 1 in 6,448. Okay? So we're not afraid. We as a society are generally not afraid of being the victim of phishing attacks. But there are other things, right, that we are maybe more likely to incur or less likely to incur that we are afraid of. So your odds of dying from a lightning strike are 1 in 135,000. Your odds of dying as a pedestrian are 1 in 701. People aren't afraid to walk down the street, generally. Odds of dying in a car accident are 1 in 19,000. People don't generally fear driving in a car. Odds of a child being born with extra fingers or toes are 1 in 500. People don't generally fear this. But what people do fear are things like terrorism, in which your odds of being the victim are 1 in 20 million. Right? So your odds of being a victim of terrorism is virtually none. Right? But yet we're afraid of it. So the question then is, why do we fear what we fear? So psychologists and sociologists have tried to answer this question for a while. Some psychological theories have to do with evolution, right? And so the things that we fear in some regards are sort of like evolutionary hangovers, like snakes. People who are afraid of snakes or spiders. Now maybe there's a time in our evolutionary history where that was an advantageous thing to be afraid of. Sociologists are more interested in how social factors affect fear, right? So there's theories of contagion, right? If people fear something and it spreads, right? That's a way of making the masses fear something. But primarily, we find the news media to be a source of fear in society. And so you can just watch these headlines coming on screen. Could your fridge kill you? I can't read that one because it's too small. Nightmare on Wall Street brings big losses. 1,200 people killed by mental patients. Port meats in your burger. Stranger danger alert. Killed by condoms. Right? These are headlines that are made to prey on fear in order to get people to read them. Right? So our news media has become, in some ways, less about reporting news and more about getting readership. Right? And so as a result, headlines have to be sort of loud and attractive. So this only works if people are watching the news, though. Right? So about 38% of people in the United States regularly report reading a newspaper. About 71% report regularly watching local TV news. And about 38% of Americans regularly watch cable news. And there's been a lot of research on sort of crime reporting in the news. And I will say that cable newscasts do tend to be a little bit more sensationalist than do local newscasts. If you watch Bill O'Reilly, you would know this, for example, right? And a variety of other people as well, right? There's a lot more passion sort of put on the air in cable news stories. But these stories do affect what people are afraid of. So I'm going to give you the example of crime. It's actually one of the biggest distorted things that we see in the news. These are two tables. One is the perceptions of trends in crime problem nationally. So the percentage of people thinking there is more crime in the last year than there has been, or more crime in the year. Let me say that again. More crime than there was a year ago. The lighter green is less, and the lightest green is the same. And then this is the actual crime rates from 1973 to 2010. So just to give you an idea, the average media outlet, 17% of their non-ad time is dedicated to crime reporting. Right? And crime is not the only newsworthy thing that happens in society, but it tends to be what we talk about. It's a disproportionate amount of the news media. So looking at this specifically, one of the most striking reports I found was between the year 1990 and 1997, the homicide rate went down 20%. And this is overall crime rate, it's not just homicide. But the homicide rate went down 20% between those 7 years. But news stories about murder increased 600%, right? So and to go along with that, about 20% of Americans fear being murdered, right? The actual odds of being murdered are 1 in 19,000. So about the same as getting hit by a car annually is the chance you'll get murdered in your entire life. Right? So that we disproportionately fear being murdered. And it has a lot to do with news reporting on murder. Murder is actually, anyone want to guess what % of the crime murder is? If you're in my class, we just talked about it. But it's less than 1%, but very close. That's a gold star too. I've got a wiggle room for my gold stars. Right, so it's actually less than 1% of all crime is murder. But we think, when I ask my students to tell me what % of crime is murder, they think 15, 20% of crime is murder. So we have a very disproportionate understanding of murder rates because that's what's reported on. So giving you a little bit more, so I just told you the odds of being murdered, about 1 in 19,000. The odds of being accidentally killed by a firearm, 1 in 6,000. Odds of being killed by bees, 1 in 76,000. Odds of being killed by accidental poisoning, 1 in 119. But the odds of having one's identity stolen are 1 in 18.2. But again, we don't fear having our identity stolen. So fear, so capitalizing on fear might be one way to get people to pay more attention to these things. Fear is really powerful. These are just some propaganda posters from, I guess the 1950s to the present in the U.S. society, right? So fear was enough to make people turn in their colleagues and their friends as communists during the Red Scare, enough to have an internment of Japanese Americans. The loose lips sink ships was from World War II, and you've seen the Obamacare one, I'm sure. So fear is a very powerful motivator. And we fear what we are told to fear. About 14% of Americans think that it's probable that they're going to be involved in a plane hijacking. 33% of people refuse to travel abroad because they fear an airplane-related terror threat. And again, the odds of being in a terrorist attack are 1 in 20 million. So this is a very irrational fear. But it is what the media tells us to be afraid of. It is what we're told to be afraid of in the news. Another interesting sort of fact, as an aside, that I found while I was doing this is that because we're actually 37 times more likely to die in car crashes than on commercial flights, it's estimated that for every 20% decrease in the number of people flying, people spend an extra 2% of time in cars, which means that 800 more people die as passengers and pedestrians a year than would be killed otherwise, right? So actually flying less kills more people, which is kind of fascinating. So, but until recently, I know, right? Until recently, we were not told to fear cybercrimes. And this is, so about 10% of crime reporting is white-collar crime. So again, of all reporting, crime makes up 17%. Of that, about 10% is about white-collar crime. Less than 1% is about phishing, internet scams, anything. And it usually only comes up in intermittent stories about specific crime scams, or things like the stories about the elderly getting victimized, right? So they're very specific sort of human interest stories, as opposed to, like, there was another phishing attack today, right? It's not reported on the same way that other crime is. So a more recent example, right, was this Heartbleed attack. So it was announced the night of the 7th, so the first news articles about it came out on the 8th. These are the New York Times cover pages. There's a tiny story, you can't see this, I realize, because it's too small, on the bottom part of the page on the 9th and on the 10th, and it is not on the news again for the rest of the week, right, on the New York Times. So the reporting about it essentially, at least it moved to the back pages, right, of the New York Times. So it's a very slow-lived news story relative to other things that are happening in the news. Okay, so what do we do about it, right? I've talked about how people don't know to be afraid, they don't understand the costs, and they don't see themselves as potential victims. So is the solution awareness? And we find, again, that I told you that if people are victims of cybercrime, they're actually not less likely to be victimized again. They are less likely, they're about 4% less likely to use the internet to do their banking, so that there's a little bit of a deterrent factor in that regard, but they're just as likely to get caught a second time, or more likely than non-victims. But we do find that people who express concern, people that are aware of cybercrime, are less likely to be the victims. So if people know about it, they are less likely to be victimized. So people who had not heard news stories about issues related to cybercrime and cybersecurity are far more likely to, say, log into unsecure networks to do their banking than are others. So it does have an effect. We don't know exactly the magnitude of the effect, but we do see a trend in where people have information are less likely to make these mistakes. So then what do we do about it? So obviously the answer would be to increase awareness, increase knowledge to sort of fix this problem. And one way to do that might be to change the news stories. And how do you do that? Right? So you could write letters to the editors.
Phishing letters.
Phishing letters to the editors. If you're doing research here at UI, you can talk to the UI media relations, and they actually will help you get your research out to the public. And that might be through press releases, or it might be through, if they get contacted by, say, a reporter from NPR who's interested in doing a story on a given topic, if you contact the media relations people, they'll have your name and they'll refer them to you. Right? So if your specialties, you can go and talk to them about, and then they'll make sure things are filtered to you. Other things that we can do as an institution that may not change sort of broader society are things like games for employees. So this link that I'm going to click on is also from Wombat, and we're going to play this game together quickly. So we're going to learn to spot fraudulent emails. You have to agree to the terms. Don't worry, I looked at them. And then I'm going to skip through the instructions, because essentially what we're going to do is they're going to give us an email, and we are going to have to look at it and decide whether or not the red bubbles are a trap or harmless. And if it's a trap, we have to disarm it. If it's harmless, we have to click on harmless. The goal is to do that without having all of these little fish down here kidnapped by the net, because every time we do something wrong, they're going to get kidnapped. Okay. We're going to look at 2 emails if I can get there. Okay. Start. All right, so here's our email. It's from Rod Smith. How do we feel about Rod Smith? Is he someone do we ignore that, or do we disarm that? Is that a trap?
You want real answers.
I want real answers. We're disarm. You say disarm. Everyone say disarm.
Depends on whether you know them.
Not correct. It is actually not necessarily a trap. It could be. But if you don't know the sender, then you should be cautious. So he recently inherited $750,000. Is that something that is a trap?
Yes.
Okay, so we know that. So we got that right. He wants our bank account information, right? So we know that's a trap. And we can read the obituary here. Is this a trap? Yes. Okay. Yeah. All right. So then we can go to the next email. Oh, this is it. So this is an email from Wombat Account Services. First is our name, Phyllis. Is that legitimate? Is that something that could make us be concerned? Obviously, my name is not Phyllis, but right. So no, we can ignore that. That's harmless. Thanks for updating the information in your account. Is that something that we should be concerned about? Ignore it? Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. If this is incorrect, please notify us immediately at wombat.com, correct at wombat.stmnt459.com. We're going to disarm that one? Yeah. Yeah, all right. Correct, it's a trap. So then we won't have to play all the rounds, but you get a score at the end, and you can play it as many times as you want. All right, so this is one thing that some businesses are doing in order to make sure that their employees are more aware of things like phishing scams. You can go play with Phyllis all you want in your free time. And then the last thing I want to mention is the Department of Homeland Security recently came out with a campaign called the Stop, Think, Connect campaign, and Jim has been doing a lot of sort of promotion of this. Do you need to leave? No. Okay. of this campaign. So I'm going to show you, they have a series of public service announcements. I can show you more, but my personal favorite, and Kevin's, is a rap song that was put on by some, I guess, elementary, middle school kids in DC, which is a part of this campaign. And this is being distributed as widely as possible, but this particular one is, I think, targeting young people. Oops, unless I pause it. Oh, volume we want.
Hopefully we have volume.
You can't hear it.
So
Oh man, this is, maybe you can't, I don't know.
can we get volume from the computer? Just ask,
Oops, not if I do that.
just ask video people.
Can we have volume for the computer?
Check the volume on the video and on your computer.
It is up on my computer.
How about on the video on the far right, at the bottom of the scroll bar?
On the,
Go on the video again where you paused.
right here, yes, here,
And the far right is the volume
There.
icon. That's
yes,
up.
that's up.
Okay, go ahead and unplug your computer from the Y cable.
Okay,
Their skills while at the
Well,
same
now
time
it's talking.
spreading an important message.
you know, I have,
And then your microphone will pick it up.
oh yeah, I suppose they, not for you guys, but I actually have another cable handy here, just in case. Maybe, if there's a place for it. There's actually no place to plug it in. Never mind. Well, that's sad. Oh, Kevin, you're saved. You don't have to hear it.
Probably hear it. That laptop's pretty loud.
Let's get this party pumping.
Can you hear it?
There's a lot of hidden dangers out there in cyberspace. Always give her permission for any website. And if you don't want friends, then it's a sure bet. If you spread nasty rumors on the internet, never put your personal information online unless you ask your parents and they say that it's fine. Cyber. Fake. Fake. Before you log on, don't be hasty. Please be smart with online safety. Stop and think before your connection. Use these steps for your protection. Online safety. Online safety. Online safety. Online safety. Cyber. Fake. Cyber. Online safety.
Hold it. And cut.
So then they actually will go on to sort of talk about the goal in here, but because you can't hear it very well, I'll skip that part. So they actually have a series of PSAs that they're putting out. This one is targeting children, but they have others that are aimed for slightly older kids or businesses. There's one about like why you need to make sure your Facebook profile is secure, why you shouldn't log on to insecure networks because people, and then they have someone hack someone's Facebook account in that particular example. So there was a series of these, and they're intended to sort of to increase awareness and knowledge. So if the news is not reporting these stories in the same way that they report other stories, so people are not learning that they need to be afraid of problems such as phishing attacks, how is it that we make them more aware? So these are some ways that we might be able to do it, unless we can learn quick sound bites, right? I mean, that's part of why news works, is that there's quick sound bites that people can latch on to in order that will then echo in their head when they're making decisions or when they're doing things. So we need to figure out ways to market this sort of knowledge and information in that way, right? So that it will resonate with people. So the last thing I was going to talk about is future directions in research. So Dr. Chain, Kevin, and I are doing something that's not related to cybersecurity necessarily, but we're starting a project that looks at perceptions of security risk and security management in the case of elementary age kids traveling to school. So in the last last 40 years or so, there's been a dramatic decrease in the number of kids who walk to school or bike to school. We're going to look at why that's the case, what it is that parents are afraid will happen to their kids, and what we can do to make parents, or what could be done to make parents both feel more secure, and also what would they be willing to do, right? So would they be more secure if they got an email from the school if their child didn't show up on a given day, would that be enough to make them feel confident walking to school? Or would they want to put a microchip in their child's backpack? Would that be enough? Or do they want to microchip their children? What would people be both interested in doing and willing to do, right? So people might think, yeah, microchipping my kid would make them really safe, but they might not be willing to do that. So that's one of the things that Dr. Chang, Kevin, and I are going to be working on. But I do think from preparing for this talk, I became really aware of how little research is done on this. So why do people fail to take these precautions? Why do people fail to see the threat? We know that they don't. We know that they lack this knowledge. But what can we do to change this human behavior? So one of the things that I think would be a great experiment is if there was a way that we could pre and post test people. If we had a series of people that we either did an experiment or a survey with about this issue, and then gave them lots of information, showed them news stories about attacks or whatnot, and then post tested them to see if their behavior changed. Right? So what can we do in order to make people feel, to arm people better for these issues? So what sort of I have about 10 minutes for questions. What, if any, questions do you have? Yeah, Bert.
So this is strictly with respect to the case of credit card fraud. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering whether or not there's going to be some kind of like systematic way that let me just restart. So it looks like it's very similar to like the prison dilemma, right? So if my credit card ends up getting stolen or get used somewhere, the bank sort of helps cover my butt for that. And of course, I want to pick a bank where they take care of me like that, because that means I have to worry less about being safe. So I'm wondering how effective a method would actually be. So you could tell me, like, look, there's going to be all these big rises in costs if you continue to behave this way. But if I think, well, if I start being more careful, but most other people are not going to be, the cost is still going to be high, and so that doesn't benefit me at all. And in fact, if you tell me, no, we'll even convince the other people that they'll start behaving better, then I think, well, then the cost goes down, and I can still just, not be that careful about it. And so I'm wondering whether or not there's something like that going on, and whether or not that diminishes the effectiveness of this strategy to try to say, well, let's try to increase people's awareness.
Yeah, so I think, I think maybe, but largely I think people don't think about it. I don't think people are giving it that much thought. But I will say that there are some banks, and I don't know that all of them do, that if you have your credit card compromised a certain number of times, you have to then start paying. You have to, like, the third time you have to get a new credit card within a couple of years, you have to pay $50 or whatever. So that's a way to sort of make you behave better. But I think largely one of the speakers that we had in this series talked about how in Europe, right, they have these chips on the cards, and there's other ways that credit card companies are going at this that actually sort of aren't about consumer use or the way that people are using their credit cards, but how they can make them more secure because people are loose cannons, right, and not reliable. So I think most of the attention is on how, given that people are going to act irrationally, how can we make the system more secure anyway?
I mean, I would say that's still a rational action for me to do, right? But that's one of those weird things about these kinds of game setups, right? It looks like something that's suboptimal, and yet from an individual's perspective, that's exactly what you should keep doing. But,
right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So collective rationality, we'll say.
Yeah. It's collectively irrational.
Collectively irrational,
but
individually rational. Yeah. I like it.
Have you seen the study that MITRE did on phishing attacks? No. I'm trying to remember how much they published. It was an I3P group, but they did a study, sent out a bunch of phishing attacks. If you clicked through, it went to a training page, and then they did a follow-on 9 months later. And it was with the company doing the regular awareness training and other things in addition to this, click and train, and it was surprising the percentage of people that still went through again, like you said, those who don't learn from their own past behavior.
Yeah. So then, is training even going to help, right? If this experiment is showing that 9 months is long enough time for people to forget what they learned, like how often if we did training every month, would that be enough? If there were penalties, do there have to be additional penalties in order for people to care or respond? And what has to happen in order to get people to behave differently? And we don't know. Is really the answer, and that's where we need to start investigating. Were you going to say something else?
One of the suggestions, I guess, that comes out of this is what are the kinds of incentive structures that you can set up, right? So that's how an economist, I'm not an economist, but that's an economist would try to approach this. So it's interesting to hear you say that the credit card companies, if you start having all these instances where there's so much fraud, that they start like charging you as a result of that. So do you have any ideas of some other ways of setting up incentive structures besides just like scaring people, right? Is there some way that you can
And it's not the credit card companies, it's banks that are doing that.
Right, okay.
Individual banks are saying, this is a cost. So other incentive structures besides fear. I go, let's just scare everyone. I don't think there's something we can do on a societal level. Like, I don't know how we would implement something like society-wide, right? But I do think employers, right, have things that they can do, right? So employers could, every time if they are aware that you have, clicked on an phishing email, might be able to force you to do training or force you to do something. But I don't know that there's anything like on a grand scale we can do, because I don't know how you would even enforce that.
Yeah.
So I think other than giving people information, it doesn't have to be scaring. But I do think but what we know, right, is emotions are motivators. And so, the sappy stories work. So touching people's heartstrings or peer pressure. But that also will involve knowledge people have to know.
One other thing a lot of people are looking at, trying to increase the cost for the attackers. Just imagine if everybody had to pay a penny per email, how expensive it would be to send out these massive phishing emails. But for me, I don't send out that many per day. But if they're sending out hundreds of thousands or millions of emails a day, they're trying to think, is there a way of making the cost? Research has shown that actually most of the income generated through these types goes through 3 banks in the world. But there are banks in countries we can't touch. And then, so there was a NSF study that I heard somebody talking about, and they were looking at, wasn't quite phishing emails, but it was spam emails on Viagra, or Viagra clones. And what was interesting is the guy said, so they went through and they actually looked at this. They received the magic blue pills in many different forms mailed to them. Sometimes in just regular envelopes or bottles, sometimes hidden inside a doll. So it was depending on how much the person was afraid of customs to send it. But every single company had wonderful customer support. When you contact them, it was a business model for both the manufacturers of the generic Viagra and the consumers. So the consumers never saw the spam as a crime, because they actually wanted this product at a cheaper price. And so I asked him, so what's the crime involved here? The consumer doesn't feel they're participating in crime. The company doesn't say it's participating in crime. Now, there is the violation of trademark law, patent law, and that type of stuff, but that's not what you're dealing with. And he said the crime is they're using these massive botnets, software established on hundreds of thousands of computers to send these massive emails. And he said, and that's how they'd get away with that penny each for sending emails. It'd be those 100,000 people, computers who are sending these emails, that'd be charged a penny each and not the actual sender. And he said, they've broken into my computer so they can send the spam. That's the crime I'm worried about. But how do we disincentivize that?
Yeah. And so when you were talking about costs, it made me think also of prison sentences, right? But we actually find that extending prison sentences for punishments for crime does not deter people from committing crimes. It's not going to be a factor in making this be a less of an issue. That's not a cost that matters, which is counter to a lot of how our criminal justice system works. But it turns out it doesn't really work. Well, if you're a sociologist, you know it doesn't work. So I'm just going to ruin that for you all and say your criminal justice system doesn't work. But so punishing people more will not be a solution. Punishing criminals more, yeah.
So my recollection from quite a while ago, some of the research on fear was people tend to fear things more if they're not in control.
Yes.
So it's sure, people get in car accidents, but not me, I'm a good driver.
Exactly.
Which may be part of the problem because, I know not to click on those emails, maybe. But if you think that way, then suddenly you're not afraid of them anymore, which is sort of a catch-22 because...
Yes. Yeah, that is actually one of the biggest factors, and that is part of why people decide to drive as opposed to fly, because they think they're in control, and then people fear things they don't control more, I think people don't even know they don't have control in this arena, right? Or because they just don't have enough information, so they probably do overinflate how much they think they have control of the situation.
So,
And that's our time.
oh, okay. Well, related to that, are you familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect? So we can talk about this afterwards, but it would be really cool to see if you found that kind of effect if you did these kinds of tests. So it's people overinflate their abilities, but it turns out that people who really do know what they're doing actually underestimate their abilities as a result of that. So it'd be really interesting to see if you found something like that for identifying these kind of phishing cases.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a study on the Craigslist scams in which people actually receive the checks and then have funds wired back to them through Western Union versus phishing? Because that happens around this area quite often, at least with all the banks I've worked in. I see that regularly.
Interesting. I actually did not come across any of those studies while I was doing this research, but I don't know. There was nothing that came up that was comparing them for sure. But I think people are even less aware of that. It's an issue. Well, thank you all.